Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second lecture on our week 5 on public opinion, polarization, and participation. Today, we'll be focusing on polarization and partisanship. So looking at what is polarization, what are the different types of polarization, and where does it come from? So we'll try to define polarization, to see to what extent America is polarized, talk about what causes it, and think a little bit, and we'll have a larger discussion section on the effects of political polarization. So what is political polarization? Morris Fiorina, a political scientist, in an article with Samuel Abrams, and this is also in the reading from Fiorina from his book, The Culture War, argues that when we have a close election and a largely divided election, right, close to 50-50 people voting on each side, right, that could either be the sign that we have the highly polarized electorate, where people disagree considerably, and that's why the election is close, or that the electorate actually is not very polarized. So they agree on a lot of things, and that overall agreement means that you're still going to have a pretty close election, right? It would only be if, let me draw in a different color here, if we had something like a distribution like this of public opinion, that we would have not close elections, right? We would just have blowouts from the conservatives. So that we have close elections is not in and of itself a sign that we have polarization. We want to know, like, is public opinion separated or not? So polarization isn't just that we have contested elections and very close elections or 50-50 elections or a relative split between Democrats and Republicans. But this is the idea, as your textbook suggests, that moderates or individuals with centrist political views lead political parties. The parties grow farther apart ideologically. The parties are more towards their ideological extremes. They're moving, if we kind of remember that box from the previous lecture, they're moving more and more to the top right and bottom left of the liberal square. DiMaggio and their co-authors in 1996 just find polarization as both a state and a process. As a state, it's the kind of the synchronous degree measurement of how far apart are the different political parties. And we also use the word polarization to describe the process of these political views moving farther apart. Now, polarization isn't necessarily the same thing as partisanship. Partisanship is the general attachment or loyalty to a political party, right? You're a Republican, you always vote for Republicans. You're a Democrat, you always vote for Democrats. This is that same idea that people will vote for this. They have party loyalty even as the party positions or their own policy positions might change. But polarization describes not simply that people are loyal to their parties, but that the party's ideological beliefs are moving further away from each other. So there is some decent evidence to suggest that the parties have become more polarized. If we look at in the House and Senate, the kind of ideological scores of members of Congress, right, we see that there was significant overlap in the 70s, some overlap in the 90s, and then we move from that kind of U-shaped normal distribution that Fiorina was talking about, right, in the earlier slide, to the bimodal distribution by post 2008, post the Obama election, right? So we also can look at it not just at the elites, but at what people say should be the top priority for Congress, that other than jobs and maybe Social Security, right, the Republicans and Democrats prioritize very different things about what should be political priorities. This is a 2019 Pew survey. The same study kind of measured this over time, and so we see that the scatter plot kind of gets separated. That in 1999, the largest gap between issues was 24 percentage points, but there were still top priorities being of education. Healthcare was on both of their top priorities. Social Security, crime was up there for both of them. Where by 2019, the largest gap was 46 percentage points. And it was the priorities for Republicans were terrorism, the economy, Social Security, immigration, and military, where we see no overlap. We have healthcare, education, environment, Medicare, poor and needy. Now, Morris Fiorina, again, with his co-authors and the book that you read, kind of offers this challenge. And they argue in this book, The Culture War, that if we actually survey public opinion, that most public opinion actually does follow what that normal distribution, that bell curve, right? That most people are slightly liberal to slightly conservative. That the vast majority, we have basically like a normal distribution, so like 68% of people. And that there are numerous similarities between red and blue state voters, but little that calls to mind this kind of culture war where like people in California have no similarities with people in Texas, or people in Alabama have nothing in common with people from New York, right? That what they argue is that it's actually a small number of elites that make it seem like there's polarization. That while elite public opinion has become more polarized, that the average people have relatively moderate political views. So if Fiorina is right, that overall most people don't have these kind of extreme views on either left or the right, and most people are kind of in the middle, why does it feel so polarized? And this is from more recent work after Fiorina, that suggests in the Mason article that you read from Lilliana Mason, that we are actually dealing with what's known as affective polarization. This is from a different article that I will post on Moodle, that partisan affect is inconsistently related to policy preferences. Is that the idea here is that they argue that the mere act of identifying with the political party is sufficient to trigger negative valuations of the opposition. So people we have polarization and a lot of dislike between the parties, not necessarily because public opinion on any particular issue is moving more and more to the extremes, but that people view their partisan identity enough, like that I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, that's enough to trigger intense dislike of the other political party. Mason, in your reading, describes this as a sense of loathing between Democrats and Republicans. And so we can look at party feeling thermometers. This is in your reading from Mason, right? That if we look at Democrats, they only have positive feelings. They have, so they have better feelings towards Democrats and pretty low feelings towards Republicans. And the same thing goes in the opposite direction by very similar numbers, right? And it also works if we're looking at on the mean issue positions, they're much less polarized, right? The mean issue position is kind of slightly left leaning, but still towards the center, and of average people, and percent that are consistent across issue positions, right? They're relatively similar. And so what we see is not so much issue polarization, but we see this kind of language, and this is from that Pew 2019 survey, right? That Republicans and Democrats see each other as closed-minded, as intolerant, as immoral, unintelligent, lazy, right? And they don't see they see their peers as open-minded, patriotic, etc. Right? That this is the type of this affective polarization. So it's not really about policy issues, but it's kind of feelings and emotions, and this kind of a visceral level of polarization. So the question then is, if there's large agreement on many issues, as Fiorina suggests in your reading, what explains the degree and depth of affective polarization? And the process here is the idea of social sorting. And this is the technical definition, the process by which social groups and identities become aligned with partisan identities. And in other writings, Mason and Wronski argue that the parties have become vastly different social compositions, that the Republican Party is now made up of white, Christian, self-identified conservatives, and the Democratic Party is generally characterized by non-white, non-Christian, self-identified liberals. That where you used to have things like conservative Democrats and liberal Republicans, right? Basically from the 1960s, you have this shift so that it's not just over issue areas, but it's kind of social framework. And what we get is that we have a world in which Democrats and Republicans inhabit different social worlds. There's evidence and studies that find that Democrats and Republicans watch different TV shows, shop at different grocery stores, drive different cars, live in different places, and generally just don't encounter one another. And this means that there are fewer cross-cutting cleavages in political identity, right? There's fewer kind of areas where you have like the example that I would give would be like the Black, gay, atheist Republican, right? That you might see some ability to kind of form coalitions with to get bipartisan legislation done, right? So things like pro-choice Republicans, evangelical Democrats, environmentalist Republicans, Democrats who hunt, we don't see these identity groups as often, right? And so this is from the 2008, this is from the Mason 18 reading again. So we see like the Republican Party, right, is 85% white, where the Democratic Party is only about 50% white. There's vanishingly small numbers of Black Americans and Hispanic Americans in the Republican Party, where they're much more represented in the Democratic Party. There's significant differences over religious service attendance, over gender, and education and income aren't as significantly different, right? But you have these social identities. The New York Times a couple of years ago, and I'll post a link to this in the Moodle page, did provide this kind of, you could follow this kind of flow chart based on like, it would predict your party identification based on a series of like, are you Black, Hispanic, or Asian or not, right? That's the first big split, right? Then it's like how religious you are or not, right? Then if you are straight or not, we have this kind of a breakdown in age, college, whether you're Protestant or not, right? And so you have, and then you have some initial splits here, but you have kind of this breakdown. So like the most likely group to be Democrats are Black women older than 30, and the most likely to be Republicans are white religious Protestants, and those who are male and live in the South are even more likely to kind of be in the party, right? So we have this splitting of social identities in the parties, right? And this means that political opponents are more likely to be seen as radically different and as enemies rather than just political competitors. That partisanship becomes part of our sense of self and social identity. Disagreements become we're disagreeing about our identity, about our sense of self and belonging rather than policy difference. As the parties become more socially conscious, it becomes an in-group versus out-group fight. Mason concludes in the reading, if partisans perceive their party to be largely made up of people who are socially similar, they will respond with higher levels of intolerance and prejudice against not only racial outgroups, but also partisan opponents. Similarly, if partisans perceive their party to include a diverse collection of in-group and out-group members, they are likely to respond to the political world with more tolerance of outsiders. So social sorting is kind of a historical story. It begins in the 50s and 60s with the civil rights movements, where we have racially conservative Southern Democrats become Republicans, where African Americans that were Republican voters since Reconstruction, since the radical Republicans occupied the former Confederacy in the mid-19th century, they became Democrats as the Democratic Party championed the civil rights movement. Nixon's Southern strategy, trying to emphasize law and order against the kind of the counterculture and racial justice movements of the 60s, just kind of tried to successfully solidify the white vote in the South. And then we have in the 80s the rise of the evangelical movement, as Protestants were actually split between the two parties until the 70s and the 80s. We have the move of conservative evangelicals to the Republican Party, right? So in this kind of post-Goldwater, post-Reagan era, right, you're going to only see, you're not going to see this idea of like Dwight D. Eisenhower wouldn't be a Republican in today's Republican Party. You're not going to have the Rockefeller Republicans. You're only going to have much more conservative, much more white, much more religious individuals. Now, many political scientists have argued that what we're actually seeing isn't polarization, but asymmetric polarization. That the average ideology among Democrats and the Democratic Party is relatively the same, but we see movement of the Republicans more towards the right. This is a study from the V-Democracy Index that focuses on party identity and organization, and they find that Democrats between 2000 and 2018 have kind of stayed in the kind of Democratic left, right? That they are not as to the left as the UK Labour Party, but they are like to the left on the economy, and they're on the kind of democracy side of if we turn that y-axis into autocracy democracy. Where the Republican Party in the year 2000 and 2002 was, more towards the economic right, obviously. But in the early 2000s, they were, here. So relatively close to the center on this y-axis. And then what we've seen instead over time is the significant move towards the kind of up the y-axis, towards the autocracy or the order end, and becoming more and more conservative, such that they are much closer to autocratic parties such as the BJP in India, the AKP in Turkey, than they are, for example, the Conservative Party in the UK or the Democratic Party in the United States. This is analysis of kind of party platforms and policy positions. And if we break it down onto the specific issues, right, in general, we have a movement on kind of significant movements from the Republican Party between 2000 and 2018 to the right on kind of questions of disrespect opponents, violating minority rights, encouraging violence. The anti-elitist rhetoric, though, that is also accompanied by the left, by the Democratic Party, anti-immigration, opposing cultural superiority, invoking religion. That we have kind of shifts to the right. Now there are shifts to the left, but you can see that on a lot of these issue areas, there is no real significant shift to the left, but there is significant shift to the right. So why do we care about polarization? Well, if the two parties are increasingly separate, polarized, and viewing each other as enemies, it decreases the incentives to compromise. Why would I compromise with someone who my constituents think are the enemy of the people or are immoral or unpatriotic, right? It also creates this self-fulfilling cycle that if you view people like enemies, that they're going to respond by viewing you like enemies, and you have increasing polarization. This less compromise breeds more polarization. We also get what's known as negative partisanship, where we start viewing politics as a zero-sum game, and you would prefer to see the other side lose rather than pursue absolute gains, right? That you will vote against a popular position because if it would give a win to the opposition president, right? That you would vote against if you would vote against $2,000 checks, for example, right? If that would give Biden a political win. We also get this was a 2006 19 poll that found that people actually preferred a giant meteor striking the earth, extinguishing all life, to Donald Trump winning re-election, which is, not a great sign, stemming from polarization. It also breeds intolerance of political opponent. And more recently, we've seen that some of the impacts of polarization can be the loss of what Hannah Arendt, the political theorist, would call a shared world. This is an article by Sean Illing on Vox. I've posted this on Moodle. And he argues that while propaganda has always been bipartisan, we're seeing more and more media-driven polarization that's become asymmetric, where the left mostly receives its news from reputable news organizations. The same isn't true on the right. American conservative media functions like a closed system. People inhabit the system, rarely interact with information behind it. So not only are they not interacting with people, but they're not interacting with ideas or information or narratives from the other side. And so if you are watching Newsmax and OAN every night, if you listen to talk radio hosts like Mark Levin claim that our Declaration of Independence and Constitution are being destroyed by the Democratic Party, if you hear Sean Hannity insist that we have a duty to investigate every claim of fraud and abuse, if you're inhaling QAnon fantasies, you're likely to be deluded about the state of the world, that we don't agree, this idea here between Republicans and Democrats don't agree on basic facts anymore, about climate change, about voter suppression, about racial discrimination, about economic inequality. And you're going to see kind of these types of events, right? If you really believe that the president, Illing continues, and you supported a landslide victory that was systematically undermined by seditious Republicans and Democrats, and that conspiracy was being covered up by a crooked and compromised media, and at the same time you saw over 100 Republican House members, multiple senators question the validity of the election, and the president was telling you to do something about it, it's not hard to see how quickly you might move from shitposting online to storming the Capitol. Our last lecture for this week is going to focus on political participation, but how people participate in politics, but also what are some of the factors that explain why people participate in politics or not. And that's it for this lecture. I will see you for the third mini lecture.